Greetings. So about 10 years ago, I think it was 2009, I did a consulting assignment for a hospital in New York City, in Harlem. I can talk about it because one, I'm not going to mention any names, and two, it's no longer a hospital. And we'll get to that. So anyway, got a call from a guy who is someone who, I'll call him a finder. He's one of those guys who is not afraid to call anybody. And he gets gigs. And of course you get someone like me who gets paid really well. And then he gets a pretty nice commission. Doesn't have to do the work. Yes, he's always selling, so it's a different type of work. But he doesn't go into hospitals. He used to way back when, but he doesn't anymore. So I get the gig. It's paying nicely. I'm going to be in New York City. I loved New York City. It's probably not necessarily the last time I was in New York City, but pretty close to the last time I was in New York City. So I'm not going to tell you about going down there and ending up in the wrong borough, because it turned out New York City has 3 142nd Streets. I'm not going to tell you that full story. I'm not going to tell you how I ended up having to change hotels and why I had to change hotels. I'm going to talk about the gig itself, because there's going to be a point at the end of this. So I'm working at this hospital. I go in for the first day, and at that time I didn't know it was in Harlem. I really didn't know all the numbers. 142nd Street. I'm glad I wasn't in 142nd Street in Harlem, but I'm working in Harlem. So I get this guy there. He's the VP of Finance. Actually, I think he even might have had a higher position than that, but he's the guy who I talk to. So he takes me over to where the office is, and it turns out that the reason I got the gig, this is odd, I got the gig because I was black. Why did I get the gig because I was black? Because most of the employees at the hospital happen to be black. That's rare. But then again, like I said, this is in Harlem. This is actually in Lower Harlem. We were about, 5 or 6 blocks away from where Bill Clinton's office was, of all things. So there you go. Anyway, I get there, and every employee except 2 happened to be black. One was white, one was Hispanic. And what I didn't know until later in the day was that they had a union dispute. So the union leader, who was not an employee, because New York City is a different kind of animal than anywhere else in the state. You don't have to be an employee in New York City to be the head of the union. So the head of the union had told them not to work with management. And that included me. So his thought was he could bring in someone black and they will work with him because he happens to be black. So this was an assignment that was just tough from the very beginning. I found basically 1.5 people who were going to help me out. Reason I say that is because the person who was the supervisor of the department knew that she was probably going to get fired. She and this guy had been fighting for the longest time. And she tried to help me out as much as she could, but, she didn't have a heart into it because she had a feeling she was going to be fired because she'd been fighting with this guy. And then there was someone else there who felt for the position I was in. She cared about the facility, so she at least offered some help, but no one else did. It was always a constant battle. I can only do so much. Usually you go in on a consulting assignment when you're in an interim leadership position, and you can ask questions and get something. I met with everybody like I do everywhere I go. But they didn't say much because there was a union dispute. So I had a conversation with this guy. I said, this is a little bit difficult. They won't really pay attention to me. He says, well, do the best you can. Because he wanted to fire that supervisor. So I talked to him once. I said, she's been really helpful to me and she's knowledgeable. He didn't like that one bit, but instead of talking to me, he talked to the guy who brought me down there. And it turns out that he had been basically cussing me out to this other guy, but not saying anything to me. So, like I said, it was a struggle. It was wonderful being in New York City. I liked where my hotel was. I was 1 block away from Madison Square Garden. I was enjoying that. I was enjoying going to a different restaurant every night, but I wasn't happy working this gig. And I started to see things. I'm not a dumb guy. And there were some things that he was doing or that he had put into place that weren't necessarily compliant. I will say that. I don't want to necessarily say illegal, because there are certain things that you can get away with in New York State that I don't know if you can get away with in other states. And I'm saying get away with because he took it to an extreme. There were some things he did that I knew, I'm sorry, this has to be illegal. This just can't be right. But there were a couple of other things he did that were legal. Now, here's something else he did. I was only over inpatient. It turns out he had sent the outpatient stuff to some other lady. I know that because I talked to her on the phone, and what she told me is he won't pay me. So I stopped submitting his claims. I'm like, wait, so there's no money coming in for outpatient work? And it turned out almost none, because one of the things they were doing was they were sending claims to Medicaid after one day before physicians had even written the medical records. That's illegal. You can't do that. However, I wasn't over outpatient. I found that out later on. So they were doing that and getting that money, but they couldn't do it for anyone else. So they couldn't bill Medicare, couldn't bill the Blues, couldn't bill anybody else. From my perspective, he was doing this thing where in New York State, if you have someone who's an inpatient, you are allowed to bill based off an admitting diagnosis instead of a discharge diagnosis. And that way you get some money. You don't have to be a hospital in distress, but usually hospitals in distress are the only ones who do it. So they were doing this. But what's supposed to happen is when someone is discharged and then the medical record is done, you're supposed to basically do a claim to refund that money and get more money back. That's how it's supposed to work. But he had basically told everyone they couldn't do that. So this, I decided, was going to be my project. I'm going to show this guy that this is how this is supposed to work and how you end up with more money. So I did. I was able to convince the person who handled that to start reprocessing those claims, sending that money back so that we could get more money in. And the process took a while. The thing is, if you're doing it on a regular basis, then your money is going to be balanced. But they hadn't done it probably in 2 years. So it took a while. It took about 5 weeks. And during that time, he had fired the supervisor. And then he had another meeting with some of us. And he started saying, you know, if we're doing such and such, it's not really fraud. Any time someone in healthcare in a leadership position says it's not really fraud, it's fraud. And so I called the guy who got me down and I said, Jim, this guy's doing illegal stuff. I don't know if he's ever going to pay you for me being down here. I don't know if he's going to pay the other consultants who are down here. I don't know. I just don't know about this. I need to think about this thing. He says, well, I hope you can stay. I said, Jim, you're going to lose a lot of money off this guy. So I decided after one more week, that was it. I'm done. I'm in a bad position here because this guy seems so unethical that I bet that if someone comes in to do an audit, he's going to try to find a way to blame this on me. There was no way that I could pull on him when I pulled on someone else years earlier where I made them sign a letter absolving me of all responsibility because this guy just wasn't going to do it. So I gave notice. I said, you know, I'm out of here. I'm giving you 3 weeks. During that time, we were sending these funds back to him and to Medicaid. And I told him, you're going to get more money coming in because you're doing this. He was livid. But he wasn't livid to me, he was livid to Jim. Poor Jim. So what happened? My last week there turned out to be a major adventure, not because of the hospital specifically. They had a flood. New York City had a flood. They shut down the subway. There were so many people trying to take the bus that there was no buses. There were no cabs. And I'm staying on 32nd Street, and I had to basically try to walk to 121st Street because this is my last week and this is the day before my last day. I got lucky. I don't know exactly what street it was, but I got far enough down where the subway was actually still open because that area wasn't flooded. I was able to get to the hospital, and the finance guy or the top guy, he comes over and he says, we just got the biggest check that we've ever gotten. What did you do? And I said, this is what I was trying to tell you. By sending money back to Medicaid, they will then repay you and you're going to get more money because they're not paying you the full shot. You're billing them off of a admitting diagnosis. You're not billing them off of their last thing, which means there's no real DRG that's been figured out. That means diagnosis related group for anyone who's not in healthcare. So they pay you less money. You're just getting money quickly to help you through the expenses. And he was stunned by that. So I'm thinking, okay, great. You've seen that I've proven this to you. I told you this was going to work. There you go. I'm out of here. Turns out that once I left, he started bad-mouthing me to almost anybody he could find. He bad-mouthed me to the guy who sent me there, Jim, and told him he wasn't paying him, which I had told Jim, he's not going to pay you. He bad-mouthed me to this other consultant company who actually was affiliated with Jim's company, and they knew ahead of time because I had talked to those people. He tried to bad-mouth me to some other people in the city, just a New York City guy. Reminds me of someone who happens to lead the country right now. I'm just saying, like a New York City guy. Here's the thing, though. Here's two things. One, as an independent consultant, as a person in healthcare, as someone who might have worked at another hospital in New York State, I haven't, but it could always happen. I had to protect my reputation. I just was not going to have someone out there being able to say that I had violated the law, that I had helped them to commit fraud. No, it wasn't going to happen. But here's number two. Number two is that this guy's reputation was bad because he had basically cheated a whole lot of people. There were more people who had been cheated out of money than I knew because the hospital was scrambling for money. If they had stuck with what I had said, it's possible they could have made more. If they had done the outpatient correctly, they definitely would have made more money. But see, this is one of those problems where you get someone in the C-suite who absolutely has no idea how the billing process works, how the revenue cycle process works, how bringing in money works. He was just scramble, scramble, scramble. So he tried to tell all kind of people. I know that because I talked to some people later on, and they said, oh boy, he really said all these things about you. But we know what he's like. You're not going to suffer any repercussions from this. But you know who did suffer some repercussions? That hospital. 18 months later, that hospital shut down as a hospital and became a nursing home because it couldn't sustain itself because of this guy. And he never got another job as far as I know because of his stupid reputation. You have to stand up for yourself. You have to protect yourself. You have to do what's right. You have to be willing to leave money on the table. Like I said, I was making good money. I'm working in New York City. I loved being in New York City. But you know, you just have to protect yourself. You can't be scared that someone else is going to do something. You know what? If you're an employee, you definitely will be able to get that whistleblower money back. And I wish that I had had outpatient and knew he was doing that because that's what I definitely would have needed to get him on that. But, who needs millions of dollars, right? Anyway, that's my story. My name is Mitch Mitchell. If you learned something from this, if you thought this was an interesting story, please think about liking the video. Let me know your thoughts. Y'all take care.